The shackles clanked against the concrete floor as Marcus Williams stumbled forward, his wife Sarah's terrified scream echoing through the courthouse hallway. Behind them, their two children, 12-year-old Maya and 8-year-old David, were being pulled in the opposite direction by uniformed officers, their small hands reaching desperately toward their parents. "This can't be happening," Sarah gasped, her voice breaking as she watched David's tears stream down his face. "This can't be legal." Judge Helena Morrison's gavel had fallen with the finality of a death sentence just minutes earlier. The Williams family is hereby sentenced to immediate transfer to the Pinewood Community Correctional Facility for a period of 18 months, effective immediately. Court dismissed. The words still rang in Marcus's ears as he was shoved toward a waiting transport van. 18 months. For what the Homeowners Association had called habitual disturbance of community peace and willful property violations. The same violations that had started 6 months ago when they dared to paint their front door red. It had been Sarah's idea initially. After 15 years in their modest two-story home on Maple Street, she'd wanted something cheerful, something that reflected their family's vibrant spirit. The Homeowners Association handbook mentioned earth tones preferred, but said nothing about prohibiting other colors. So, on a sunny Saturday morning in March, the Williams family had spent the day painting their door a warm, welcoming crimson. The first notice arrived on Monday. Property violation, unauthorized exterior color modification. Marcus had read aloud to Sarah that evening, both of them standing in their kitchen while Maya practiced piano in the living room. "They want us to repaint it beige within 72 hours. Sarah had crossed her arms, her dark eyes flashing with indignation. Beige, everything in this neighborhood is beige, or white, or gray. What's wrong with wanting a little color? That defiance had cost them everything. Now, as the transport van pulled away from the courthouse, Marcus pressed his face against the small, reinforced window to catch one last glimpse of Maya and David being loaded into a separate vehicle. His heart shattered as he saw Maya trying to comfort her little brother, her thin arm wrapped protectively around his shoulders. "Where are they taking our children?" Sarah whispered, her voice hollow with shock. The guard sitting across from them, a burly man with cold eyes and a permanent scowl, didn't bother to look up from his clipboard. "Temporary juvenile placement facility. You'll see them during designated visitation hours, if you earn the privilege." The Pinewood Community Correctional Facility sat 40 miles outside the city, hidden behind tall concrete walls topped with razor wire. As their van approached the gates, Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. This wasn't a minimum security facility for white-collar criminals or minor offenders. This was a prison in everything but name. Inside the processing center, Sarah and Marcus were separated for the first time in their 16-year marriage. Sarah was led to a row of metal chairs, where a dozen other women sat in various stages of distress, their civilian clothes already replaced by orange jumpsuits. Marcus found himself in a similar room, surrounded by men whose faces bore the same expression of bewildered disbelief. "First time?" asked the man sitting beside him. He was older, maybe 60, with graying hair and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of honest work. Marcus nodded, still too stunned to form words. "Name's Robert Chen." The man continued quietly. "Been here 3 months now. Property dispute with my HOA too. They said I was operating an illegal business because I sold vegetables from my garden to neighbors." 3 months. Marcus's voice came out as a croak. "For selling vegetables?" Robert's laugh was bitter. "Judge Morrison doesn't mess around, especially if you're not the right color or don't have the right connections." He gestured around the room. "Look around, "Son, see any white faces in here?" Marcus did look, and Robert was right. Every single person in the processing room was a person of color. Black, Latino, Asian, Native American, but not a single white face among them. A guard entered the room, his keys jingling ominously. "Williams! Marcus! Front and center!" The intake process was designed to strip away dignity, along with personal belongings. Marcus's watch, a gift from Sarah for their 10th anniversary, was confiscated along with his wallet, his wedding ring, and even the family photo he kept in his pocket. When he protested about the ring, the intake officer's response was swift and brutal. "You got a problem with the rules. Williams, maybe you need some time in isolation to think about attitude adjustment." Marcus swallowed his protest. He needed to stay strong, stay focused on getting back to his family. But as he was issued his orange uniform and assigned to Dormitory C, he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd all walked into a carefully orchestrated nightmare. The dormitory was a converted warehouse with rows of metal bunk beds stretching toward a ceiling lost in shadows. The air was thick with the smell of industrial disinfectant and human despair. Marcus was assigned a bottom bunk near the back, where the overhead lights flickered intermittently, creating an eerie strobe effect. His bunkmate turned out to be a soft-spoken man named James Rodriguez, a former teacher who'd been sentenced for willful violation of HOA landscaping ordinances after refusing to remove a vegetable garden that fed 3 families in his neighborhood. "The thing you got to understand," James said as they lay in their bunks that first night, his voice barely above a whisper, "is that this place operates on fear. They want to break you down so you'll never challenge the system again. But some of us, we're organizing, quietly." Marcus turned toward James's voice in the darkness. "Organizing how?" "Information first. Documentation. We need proof of what's happening here before we can do anything about it." James paused, then continued even more quietly. "There's a woman in the kitchen, Elena Vasquez. She's got connections on the outside. Been smuggling messages through the laundry pickup service." The next morning brought Marcus's first experience with the facility's work program. He was assigned to the furniture factory, a massive, poorly ventilated warehouse where inmates operated dangerous machinery for 12 hours a day, producing office furniture that was later sold at market price. The facility kept the profits, while inmates received meal vouchers and basic hygiene items. The work was backbreaking, the conditions unsafe, and the supervisors were quick with punishment for any perceived slowdown or defiance. Marcus watched a man collapse from heat exhaustion during his first week, only to be dragged to his feet and ordered back to work by a guard who seemed to take pleasure in the man's suffering. "Move it!" Rodriguez, Guard Captain Wesley Barnes, shouted across the factory floor, his voice cutting through the noise of machinery. "Your quota's down 15% from yesterday." James, operating a table saw, despite having no previous experience with power tools, wiped sweat from his forehead and nodded silently. The cut on his hand from the day before had reopened, leaving spots of blood on the wood he was cutting. During their brief lunch break, Marcus finally managed to ask the question that had been eating at him. "Have you been able to get any word about the children, where they're keeping them?" James glanced around nervously before answering. "Elena says they're at a youth facility called Riverside Academy, about 20 miles from here. It's not good. Marcus, the kids are being used for labor too. Packaging, agricultural work, and the conditions." He didn't finish the sentence, but Marcus could read the horror in his eyes. That night, Marcus lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with images of Maya and David. Were they scared? Were they being fed properly? Were they together? At least the not knowing was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. It was during his third week that Marcus first encountered Elena Vasquez. She was a small woman in her 50s who moved through the facility with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned to survive by staying beneath notice. She worked in the kitchen, serving meals with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had performed the same tasks thousands of times. When she handed Marcus his dinner tray, a portion of watery stew, stale bread, and canned peaches that had clearly seen better days, her eyes met his briefly. There was intelligence there, and something else. Hope. Perhaps. "Your wife asked me to tell you she's okay." Elena whispered so quietly, Marcus almost missed it. "She's working in the laundry, 12 hours a day, but she's staying strong." Marcus felt tears spring to his eyes. "Thank you," he managed to whisper back. "There's more," Elena continued, barely moving her lips as she scooped stew into another inmate's tray. "My daughter works for a civil rights organization in the city. She's been asking questions about this place, about Judge Morrison. Things are starting to move on the outside." The hope that Elena's words kindled was almost too painful to bear. Marcus had been trying to protect himself from hope, afraid that disappointment would break him entirely. But now, learning that people on the outside were fighting for them, he felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks, the possibility of justice. As winter deepened, conditions at Pinewood grew worse. The heating system was inadequate, leaving inmates shivering through long nights. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Marcus watched a man suffer through what was clearly pneumonia for 2 weeks before finally being taken to the infirmary, by which time he was barely conscious. The work quotas increased as the facility ramped up production to meet holiday orders. Guards became more aggressive, more willing to use force to maintain discipline. Marcus saw James suffer a particularly brutal beating after he stumbled and accidentally damaged a piece of furniture he'd been working on for 6 hours. "This is intentional," James whispered to Marcus through split lips as they huddled together for warmth that night. "They're trying to break us completely, physically, mentally, spiritually." But even as their bodies weakened and their spirits flagged, the network Elena had described continued to operate. Information flowed in both directions. Stories from inside the facility found their way to the outside world, while news of growing concern and activism made its way back to the inmates. It was in December, during a particularly brutal day when the temperature in the factory dropped below 40 degrees, that everything changed. Marcus was operating a drill press, his hands so cold he could barely maintain his grip on the materials. When he noticed unusual activity near the administrative offices, guards were moving with urgency, and there was a tension in the air that felt different from the usual oppressive atmosphere. During lunch, Elena appeared more agitated than Marcus had ever seen her. When she handed him his tray, her hands were shaking. "Something big is happening," she whispered urgently. "My daughter's organization got their hands on footage. Security cameras that were supposed to be disabled. Someone inside has been recording everything." Marcus felt his heart racing. "Recording what?" The beatings, the unsafe conditions, children as young as 8 being forced to work in agricultural fields. Everything. Elena's eyes were bright with tears and determination. "It's going to break tomorrow. National news. The Department of Justice is already asking questions." That evening, the facility was placed on lockdown. No one was told why, but the inmates could sense the panic among the guards. Captain Barnes moved through the dormitories with barely contained violence. clearly looking for an excuse to lash out at someone. "You all think you're so smart," he snarled at a group of inmates who had dared to whisper among themselves. "Think you can cause trouble for this facility? You're about to learn what real consequences look like." But it was too late. The footage that had been secretly recorded by a sympathetic guard, a young man named Tommy Chen, Robert's nephew, who had taken the job hoping to provide protection for his uncle, was already in the hands of journalists and civil rights attorneys. The footage was devastating. It showed children, some barely old enough for elementary school, working in freezing conditions picking vegetables for 12 hours a day. It showed guards beating inmates who couldn't meet impossible quotas. It showed the deliberate denial of medical care, the contaminated food, the dangerous working conditions. Most damning of all, it showed Judge Morrison visiting the facility, touring the operations with obvious satisfaction, and discussing profit margins with facility administrators. The audio was clear she was receiving kickbacks for every person she sentenced to Pinewood. The story broke at 6 a.m. on December 15th. By noon, news vans were gathered outside the facility gates. By evening, protesters had begun arriving from across the state. Marcus learned about the developing situation through fragments of conversation among increasingly nervous guards. They were no longer talking about quotas or schedules. Instead, they huddled together in worried groups, making phone calls and speaking in urgent whispers. The breakthrough came when Elena managed to get word to Marcus that Sarah had been moved to a different section of the facility. She was no longer in the laundry, but had been transferred to what officials called administrative segregation, which Marcus soon learned was solitary confinement. She was asking too many questions. Elena explained during the evening meal distribution, trying to organize the women, demanding to see the children. They put her in isolation 3 days ago. The news that Sarah was suffering alone in solitary confinement while protesters gathered outside was more than Marcus could bear. That night, he made a decision that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. He was going to resist, openly and directly, whatever the consequences might be. The next morning, when guards came to escort the inmates to their work assignments, Marcus refused to move. "I want to see my wife," he said loudly enough for everyone in the dormitory to hear. "I want to see my children. And I want to know why we're being held illegally in violation of our constitutional rights." The effect was electric. Other inmates, inspired by Marcus's courage, began to voice their own demands. James stood up from his bunk, his healing wounds a visible testament to the facility's brutality. "We demand medical care for sick inmates," he called out. "We demand safe working conditions and reasonable hours." Robert Chen, despite his age and the months of harsh treatment he'd endured, rose to his feet as well. "We demand contact with our families and access to legal representation." Within minutes, the entire dormitory was on its feet. Dozens of men who had been broken down systematically over months of abuse were standing together, their voices joining in a chorus of demand for basic human dignity. Captain Barnes arrived with a squad of guards, expecting to quell the disturbance with the usual combination of threats and violence. But something had changed. The inmates weren't backing down, and their resolve seemed to strengthen with each passing moment. "You're all going to regret this," Barnes snarled, his hand moving to the baton at his belt. "Every single one of you." But before he could act on his threats, the sound of helicopters filled the air above the facility. News helicopters, circling like mechanical vultures, their cameras trained on the buildings below. Outside the gates, the crowd of protesters had grown to over 1,000 people. Civil rights leaders, concerned citizens, Family members of inmates and activists from across the region had converged on Pinewood. Their chants could be heard even inside the thick walls of the dormitory. Justice now, justice now. The facility's administration was clearly panicking. Guards received constant updates through their radios, and the tension was palpable. Marcus could see the fear in their eyes, fear that their carefully hidden operation was about to be exposed to the world. It was mid-afternoon when the most significant development occurred. A convoy of black SUVs arrived at the facility, followed by what appeared to be federal agents. The Department of Justice had arrived to conduct an emergency investigation. Elena, who seemed to have sources of information throughout the facility, managed to get word to the dormitory that investigators were interviewing staff, reviewing records, and documenting conditions. More importantly, they were demanding immediate access to all inmates. "They're going to start with the children," she whispered to Marcus as she served dinner. "My daughter's organization provided them with a list of every family that's been separated." That evening, for the first time in months, Marcus allowed himself to believe that rescue might actually be possible. But even as hope grew within him, he worried about what they would find when they reached Maya and David. How much trauma had his children suffered during their imprisonment? How long would it take for them to recover from this nightmare? The answer came sooner than expected. At 7:30 that evening, a federal marshal arrived at the dormitory with a list of names. Marcus Williams was the third name called. "Federal custody," the marshal announced matter-of-factly. "You're being transferred immediately pending investigation of your case." As Marcus walked toward the dormitory exit, James reached out and grasped his shoulder. "Find our families," he whispered urgently. "Tell the world what happened here." Marcus nodded, his throat too tight with emotion to speak. He was leaving behind men who had become brothers during their shared ordeal, but he knew that their sacrifices and solidarity had made this moment possible. The processing center looked very different when Marcus entered it, as someone being released rather than imprisoned. Federal agents moved efficiently through piles of paperwork, while facility administrators watched nervously from the sidelines. The same guards who had terrorized inmates for months now stood quietly, their authority stripped away by the presence of federal oversight. Marcus's personal belongings were returned to him: his watch, his wallet, even the family photo that had sustained him through the darkest moments. But more precious than any material possession was the news that awaited him. Sarah was being processed for release at the same time, and Maya and David were already in federal protective custody. The reunion took place in a conference room at a federal building downtown. Marcus saw his children before they saw him, and the sight nearly brought him to his knees. Maya had grown thinner, her face bearing a seriousness that no 12-year-old should possess. David seemed smaller somehow, more fragile, clinging to his sister with the desperation of a child who had learned that safety could be taken away without warning. "Daddy!" David's cry pierced the air as he spotted Marcus entering the room. The little boy launched himself across the space, and Marcus caught him in arms that shook with relief and joy. Maya followed more slowly, her eyes searching Marcus's face, as if to confirm that this reunion was real and not another cruel dream. When she finally allowed herself to believe, the tears she had held back for months came in a torrent. "I tried to take care of David," she sobbed against Marcus's chest. "I tried to be brave like you taught me, but it was so hard. Daddy, they made us work so much, and the food was bad, and some of the kids got sick." "You were perfect," Marcus whispered into her hair. "You were so brave, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." When Sarah appeared in the doorway minutes later, the family's reunion was complete. She looked exhausted and traumatized. But there was fire in her eyes that told Marcus her spirit hadn't been broken. They held each other for long minutes. No words necessary to communicate the relief and gratitude they felt. The federal investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Within a week, Judge Morrison was arrested on charges of conspiracy, civil rights violations, and accepting bribes. The facility administrators were similarly charged, and Captain Barnes faced additional counts of assault and battery. But the legal consequences were only part of the story. The footage that had been smuggled out of Pinewood had sparked a national conversation about the prison industry, judicial corruption, and the targeting of communities of color through seemingly legitimate legal channels. Marcus found himself thrust into an unexpected role as a spokesperson for the families who had suffered at Pinewood. He testified before Congress, spoke at rallies, and shared his family's story with journalists from around the world. It was difficult, emotionally exhausting work, but he felt compelled to ensure that the truth was heard. What happened to us wasn't an aberration, he told a packed auditorium at a civil rights conference. It was a system working exactly as it was designed to work. A system that takes people who challenge authority, who demand their rights, who refuse to be invisible, and crushes them as a warning to others. The civil lawsuit that followed resulted in a settlement of $37 million to be distributed among the families who had been illegally imprisoned. But more importantly, it led to sweeping reforms in the judicial system and new oversight mechanisms for private correctional facilities. Elena Vasquez's daughter, Maria, became a key figure in the reform movement. Her organization grew from a small local group to a national advocacy network, monitoring judicial decisions and challenging suspicious sentencing patterns. She often credited the courage of the Pinewood inmates with inspiring the movement that followed. They showed us that even in the darkest circumstances, people can find the strength to resist injustice, she said during a television interview. My mother smuggled out information at great personal risk because she believed the truth had to be told. Marcus Williams stood up when standing up seemed impossible. That courage inspired all of us to keep fighting. The homeowners association that had initiated the Williams family's legal troubles was disbanded within 6 months, its leadership facing civil and criminal charges for their role in the conspiracy. The house on Maple Street still bears its red front door, now a symbol of defiance celebrated throughout the community. Maya and David required months of counseling to process their trauma, but they proved remarkably resilient. Maya channeled her experience into activism, starting a youth organization focused on children's rights. David, though younger and more deeply affected by the separation from his parents, slowly regained his natural optimism with the help of skilled therapists and the unwavering support of his family. Sarah returned to her work as a social worker with a renewed sense of purpose. Her experience at Pinewood gave her unique insights into the suffering of families caught up in the justice system, and she became a powerful advocate for reform at the local level. Robert Chen was among the last inmates to be released from Pinewood, his age and medical conditions requiring special attention from federal authorities. His reunion with his nephew Tommy, who had risked everything to document the facility's abuses, was one of the most moving moments of the entire crisis. Tommy faced criminal charges for his role as a guard at the facility, but his cooperation with investigators and his obvious remorse led to a sentence of community service rather than prison time. James Rodriguez, the former teacher whose refusal to remove his vegetable garden had led to his imprisonment, emerged from Pinewood with a new mission. He established a legal aid clinic specifically focused on HOA disputes, helping families navigate the complex web of regulations that could be weaponized against them. His work prevented dozens of other families from suffering the same fate as the Williams family. The physical structure of Pinewood Community Correctional Facility was demolished 6 months after its closure. The land converted into a memorial park dedicated to the families who had suffered there. A bronze plaque near the entrance bears the names of every person who was illegally imprisoned, along with a quote from Marcus Williams: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, but the human spirit, when united in common cause, is more powerful than any system of oppression." Judge Morrison's trial became a media sensation, exposing not just her individual corruption, but a network of similar schemes operating in jurisdictions across the country. Her conviction on federal civil rights charges resulted in a 25-year prison sentence and sparked investigations that led to the exposure of similar operations in 7 other states. The ripple effects of the Pinewood scandal continued for years. Legal scholars studied the case as an example of how systematic racism could operate through supposedly neutral legal mechanisms. Policymakers crafted new legislation to prevent similar abuses. Most importantly, communities across the country began to pay closer attention to local judicial decisions, recognizing that democracy requires constant vigilance. 5 years after their release, the Williams family gathered in their backyard for Maya's high school graduation party. The red front door was still there, faded now, but still bold against the white siding of their house. David, now 13 and tall for his age, was manning the barbecue with Marcus, their easy conversation a testament to the healing that had taken place. Maya, valedictorian of her class and bound for college with a full scholarship to study civil rights law, stood before her family and friends to give a toast. 5 years ago, our family went through something that should never happen to anyone, she began, her voice strong and clear. But we learned something important, that ordinary people, when they refuse to give up, when they stand together, can change the world. Sarah, watching her daughter speak with pride and love, thought about the letter she'd received that morning from Elena Vasquez. Elena was now living with her daughter Maria, her health fragile after years of hard work, but her spirit unbroken. In the letter, she had written, "The garden James planted in his yard has grown beyond what any of us could have imagined. The seeds of justice you all planted at Pinewood are bearing fruit everywhere." As the evening wore on, and their friends and neighbors shared stories and laughter in their backyard, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The trauma would always be part of their story, but it no longer defined them. They had survived. They had fought back, and they had helped ensure that other families would be spared similar suffering. The red door had started as a simple desire for color in a bland world. It had become a symbol of the right to be different, to stand out, to refuse conformity when conformity meant accepting injustice. Most importantly, it had brought them to a deeper understanding of the power of community, the importance of courage, and the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. As the last guests departed, and the Williams family cleaned up together in the fading twilight, David looked up at his father. "Dad, do you ever think about painting the door a different color?" Marcus smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "What do you think, buddy? Should we change it?" David considered the question seriously, then shook his head. "No. I think it's perfect just the way it is. It reminds everyone that we're not afraid to be ourselves." Maya laughed, joining the conversation as she carried a stack of plates toward the house. "Besides, it's not just our door anymore. It belongs to everyone who believes that justice is worth fighting for." Sarah, watching her family with deep contentment, nodded her agreement, then read it stays. Forever. The door remained red, a beacon of hope and resistance on Maple Street, reminding everyone who passed that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance can spark the most important changes. The Williams family had learned that lesson the hard way, but in learning it, they had helped create a world where future families might never have to face such a choice between conformity and dignity. In the years that followed, their story continued to inspire others. The Pinewood Memorial Foundation, established with part of the settlement money, provided legal aid and support services to families facing similar challenges. The foundation's motto, suggested by David during one of their family meetings, was simple but powerful: stand together, stand strong. And on Maple Street, behind a red front door that had become famous around the world, the Williams family continued to live their lives with courage, compassion, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of justice. They had learned that the arc of the moral universe might be long, but when good people work together, they can help bend it toward justice themselves. The story of the Williams family and Pinewood Community Correctional Facility became more than just a tale of legal corruption exposed and justice achieved. It became a reminder that in any society, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and that the greatest changes often begin with the smallest acts of courage. A red door, a refusal to back down, a community that chose to stand together when standing together mattered most. Their victory was not just personal. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been told to conform, to be quiet, to accept injustice as inevitable. It proved that ordinary people, armed with nothing more than truth and determination, could indeed change the world. And in a time when such proof was desperately needed, the Williams family's story shone like a beacon, lighting the way forward for all who would follow in their footsteps.